مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في رواياتها الأشهر ثم لم يبقى أحد تقتل كاتبة الروايات البوليسية أغاثا كريستي ببطء 10 دقائق واحدا تلو الآخر. في نسخ الانتخابات التمهيدية الجمهورية تبقى 3 من المجموعة الأصلية التي تجاوز عددها 15 مرشحا. وكما هو الحال في الرواية، لم يكن أحد ليخمن الثلاثة المتبقين على الساحة. لمناقشة كل هذا يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم الصحفيين السياسيين ريبيكا بيرغ من Real Clear Politics وأريال كوهن من Washington Examiner. And welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with Rebecca Berg and Ariel Cohen to talk about our presidential election campaign, focusing first on the Republicans. And then there were just 3. We started with so many when this all began about a year ago, and now just 3 wildly different people. Donald Trump, John Kasich, and Ted Cruz. Who'd have thought that these would be the 3 that would have survived this far? When we look at their policies beyond the personalities, what are the real differences among Trump, Cruz, and Kasich?
What is so remarkable about this group of 3 Republicans is that they are so different when it comes to policy. You have Ted Cruz, who has established himself as a staunch social conservative. So on issues like abortion, gay marriage, these are what he focused on at the very religious liberty is another. These are the issues he focused on at the very beginning of this campaign and really stood apart from the rest of the field in that respect. But he's also staunchly conservative on issues, economic, foreign policy, whereas Kasich and Trump are both much more moderate. So people don't often think of Trump as a moderate Republican, but in fact he has actually gone against the Republican grain on issues like trade that are very important to conservative Republicans. He is not a free trade Republican, doesn't support free trade deals like NAFTA or like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being negotiated at this time. He actually is more of a fair trade Republican, which is very unique for him. And then you have someone like John Kasich, who is an extremely moderate Republican, in spite of having been in the Republican establishment for a long time. He's a governor of Ohio, which is a swing state. And so he, as a politician, has needed to moderate his stances in order to continue to be elected. He's a Republican who would do very well in the general election, according to most polling, because he brings in Democrats, he brings in independents, but that is a challenge for him in a Republican primary, and it's one of the reasons he's only won his home state, and that's the only state to date that he has won.
And Ariel, when we focus just on foreign policies, what do you see as the big differences between a Ted Cruz and a Donald Trump?
Well, when we look at foreign policy, the big issues in 2016 are obviously nuclear weapons and the Islamic State. And the difference between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz on those issues is that Donald Trump doesn't have as much foreign policy experience, obviously, because he's never been a politician before. He talks about nuclear weapons in a much more cavalier sort of way. He has, loosely threatened that the United States would use nuclear weapons if provoked. He hasn't necessarily discouraged other countries from developing their own, which is a very serious issue in this election. Ted Cruz, while he is hawkish in his own way, would not promote that at all. So that is a huge difference between the two of them.
And it does seem that Donald Trump hasn't really thought a lot about foreign policy either, which is so unique for a presidential candidate of any party. Usually foreign policy and national security are at the center of a presidential campaign, and one of the first areas where a president is expected to really have a commanding knowledge and very strongly held beliefs and stances. But Donald Trump really, when you dig right below the surface, does not have any strongly held foreign policy beliefs.
It's a very new concept to him, whereas Ted Cruz has thought about this much more, is much more experienced. A lot of voters trust him to be much more thoughtful about foreign policy decisions.
So let's look at the core supporters of each of the main candidates and how they differ. I mean, we've talked about the policies they project, but how would you say the core supporters of Donald Trump differ from the core supporters of a Ted Cruz?
Well, between Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, we see two very different sides of the Republican Party. Donald Trump voters, they're frustrated. They've maybe been out of work for a long time. They don't like to see how America's been weakened on the international stage. They want to see our economy doing better. And while Ted Cruz voters also want to see America be stronger in an international sense and do better economically, they have two very different views of how they want to see that get done. Ted Cruz represents a more conservative, thoughtful process, whereas Donald Trump, he's just like, I'm going to make America great again. I'm going to get this done. And a lot of voters who support Donald Trump, they want to believe that. They just want that to be true. And they sort of latch on to his out there, maybe more bombastic policies. He says things that they're thinking and they want to hear, but no one else is saying.
Now, you've been to these Trump rallies. What are they like?
They are electric. They are kind of like rock concerts. But there's also this very strong tension in the room. So we've seen at many of these rallies incidents of violence break out, often between protesters who show up to these rallies to protest Donald Trump and the things that his candidacy stands for in their minds. And then the people who are supporting Donald Trump oftentimes will fight either verbally or even physically with some of these protesters. And we've seen incidents, especially recently, of this happening at his rallies. And it's something that Donald Trump has said he doesn't condone, he doesn't promote, but the other candidates have urged him to begin to answer for this climate at his rallies. He hasn't really done anything to try to tone down his rallies, to try to stop these incidents of violence. And it's something we haven't really seen in presidential politics for a very long time. Donald Trump getting up on stage, sort of mocking the protesters that come to his rallies, oftentimes jokingly, he says, encouraging the sort of violence that we're seeing at these rallies toward protesters. It's very, very interesting. But when you talk about, when Donald Trump really talks about his candidacy bringing new people into the party, you don't really see that at his rallies in terms of the cross-section of America that you might expect a transformational candidacy to bring. It's a lot of the people who, based on polling, based on exit polling in these states, who we would expect to be supporting Donald Trump. So a lot of white voters, a lot of what we would consider older voters, working class oftentimes, not college educated, and that's reflected as well in these rallies.
And how about Republican women? Do they, we talk a lot about Hillary Clinton and attracting women's votes, success or not success. Is there a Republican women's vote, and are they moving in one direction or the other?
Well, Republican women as a whole have been turned off by Donald Trump. A recent poll came out that said something like 80% of married women who identify as Republican are against Trump, which is very telling. He said a lot of things that are derogatory towards women. Recently, an ad came out showing a bunch of women reading statements that Donald Trump has said, which are often quite vulgar and upsetting. He really has turned off the women vote, and that is going to hurt him in a lot of states coming up, because you can be popular among white males, you can be popular among uneducated people, but if you don't have the female vote, that's about half your electorate right there, which is really going to hurt him. Now, Ted Cruz, going back to what we were talking about before, he's been able to capture this sort of establishment Republican vote. In the beginning of his campaign, he was so conservative that people weren't really responding to his message. But when we've come to this sort of anything but Trump sort of rallying cry, Ted Cruz is the most plausible option. So a lot of Republican women, while they don't love his how socially conservative he is on certain issues like equal pay or maybe women's health care, that they will vote for Ted Cruz because he's not Donald Trump and he's not out there saying sexist and vulgar things about women on national TV every day.
And when you add it all up, among the three that are at least still standing among the Republicans, who does best against Democrats? It would seem like this is the fundamental question that Republicans should be asking themselves.
Part of the struggle that so many Republicans are having right now when they look at this field is they see Donald Trump as the only person who mathematically at this stage could lock up the nomination before the Republican convention in Cleveland, so in what we would consider the normal primary process. Ted Cruz, on the other hand, is the most likely victor if this contest goes to an open convention. So if no candidate wins the majority of the vote in the normal primary process. Then it goes to the Republican convention. Ted Cruz has the best organization in that scenario. But what is so difficult for Republicans to square with this situation is neither Ted Cruz nor Donald Trump does very well stacked against Hillary Clinton in a general election. Donald Trump turns off a lot of voters for the reasons we've talked about in this show. He turns off women because he offends them. He doesn't really appeal to college-educated voters. Minorities, certainly he has offended a number of times throughout the campaign, and so he struggles in a general election for those reasons. Ted Cruz is very, very conservative, and so you don't see him winning over as many independents or Democrats in a general election. And so Republicans are faced with these two candidates, these two likely nominees who really don't do very well in the general election and likely, based on the polling we have right now, would lose to Hillary Clinton. John Kasich, the case that he is making right now to be the Republican nominee if this race goes to an open convention, is that he could beat Hillary Clinton. The polling shows right now that he would beat her by high single digits, probably 7 to 9 points. And of course that could change over the course of a general election, but because he is a more moderate Republican who isn't necessarily well suited to a Republican primary, that would actually help him in a general election.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about this crazy situation and whether or not Republicans will turn to a white knight to help them out of the depths of nominating someone who stands little chance of winning in November. In just a moment. Again, our panel of political experts includes Rebecca Berg. Rebecca is national political reporter for Real Clear Politics. Also with us is Ariel Cohen. Ariel is a campaign reporter at the Washington Examiner, covering our presidential elections. So Ariel, let me ask you, when you look at this Republican situation, what is the possibility that Republicans, when they get to Cleveland, if Donald Trump doesn't win it on the first round, that they look for a white knight who might actually stand a chance?
Well, right now we need a candidate to get to this magic number, 1,237 delegates. And it's looking increasingly likely that Donald Trump won't get there. So if he doesn't get there, if Ted Cruz doesn't get there by the time we get to Cleveland, there is this possibility, as you mentioned, that the Republicans will look for a white knight to come riding in. But right now we don't necessarily know who that would be. There have been many rumors about who might be drafted or nominated against their will, almost it seems. Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, recently had to hold a press conference and say, I don't want to do it, it's not going to be me. Stop talking about it being me, because a lot of people thought that he would be a great option for the Republican Party right now. But at this point, there really are very few options, and so people are turning their eyes back to Ted Cruz, because he's been in the race, he's been running, he has a lot of supporters. While he's obviously not Donald Trump, but he has a lot of support behind him, and that could translate well in a convention scenario. His campaign has been secretly working, or not so secretly working, to get these delegates to switch their vote to him maybe in the second round of voting at a convention.
And the Trump campaign has not only fought against this idea of stealing delegates, but has hinted at riots, violence if things don't go their way in Cleveland. Is this a serious fear, Rebecca?
Well, it is for the Trump campaign, because to this point, we haven't seen them well organized at the state level. And so they call it stealing delegates. Really, this is just how the convention process works. So by virtue of no candidate having won the majority of delegates in the normal primary process, you have to settle it over a number of ballots at the convention. And after the first vote, the delegates are unbound, so the primary results in the various states no longer bind them to vote for any particular candidate, and they can vote for whoever they want. That's the way the party has always worked. That's the way the process has always worked. We've just rarely had conventions because usually the nominee is picked in the normal primary process. Usually there is not this competitive primary that we've seen this time around. And so calling it stealing the nomination is a convenient phrasing for Donald Trump, because he just hasn't had the campaign apparatus of someone like Ted Cruz to go from state to state, make sure that the delegates being selected at the state level, because this is a state process, it's not a national process for Republicans, to make sure that at the state level delegates are being selected who on the second or third vote at the convention would support them. But Ted Cruz has been very, very good at this. And that's why, if we're talking about a contested convention scenario, Ted Cruz is probably going to emerge as the Republican nominee, because he has gone around and actually done the legwork on the ground to ensure that the delegates being picked are supporters of his.
And so what does Donald Trump have to do to prevent all this? I mean, what does he have to do between now and Cleveland to put all this to rest?
Well, the simplest route obviously would be to get those 1237 delegates before we get to Cleveland. But in the case that that doesn't happen, what Donald Trump would need to do is do what Ted Cruz has been doing now and ensure that these delegates, when they're freed up on the second or third round of voting, do go to his campaign. We saw recently that Donald Trump was very upset with delegates in Colorado when he maybe he didn't realize or he didn't know that the delegates could switch to Ted Cruz at the state convention when they picked which people would represent which voting precincts in July in Cleveland. So this would cause a big problem for Donald Trump. He needs to be on the ground working like Ted Cruz. He needs to get these delegates on his side as quickly as he can, because we're running out of time at this point.
But you mentioned the potential riots that Donald Trump has talked about. And this is actually a major problem for the Republican Party, because the party has never, well, not in recent memory at least, been in a situation where voters have needed to understand the nuts and bolts of the primary process, so the inner workings of how the nominee is chosen. Usually you have popular votes that line up with the delegate count, and you have an obvious nominee by the end of the primary process, and everyone's happy and it's easy and they don't need to explain any more than that. But really, it's a very complicated primary process from state to state. It varies. And now the Republican Party finds itself in the position of having to explain this to regular voters who are not really engaged at the level of knowing all these details, to prevent them from lashing out at a convention or after a convention if the result isn't what they wanted.
So we have a tough enough time explaining the electoral college system, especially to our foreign viewers. So now trying to explain our primary system is exponentially more complicated. Just so that our viewers understand, this is not actually a governmental process. This is run by our political parties, and they make up the rules any way they want. Actually, it's not even bribing if you want to offer free tickets and goodies to delegates to make them change their vote. There's nothing illegal about this.
Exactly. Up until relatively maybe the past century or so, parties just sort of got together at maybe a meeting place, and they just sort of chose their delegate based on who they liked the best, who bought them a beer even. You know, it wasn't this meticulous of a process. And now they've tried to make it seem much more democratic, and it is, because the voters have much more of a say. But this whole concept of picking delegates and pledging delegates and who you vote for at the micro level and who represents you at the convention, there's a lot of finagling that can happen in between there, because it is a party-run process. Now, on the Democratic side, it's much different, and we don't have this issue of rounds of voting. We have superdelegates, which is an entirely different concept. So for both parties, this whole primary to convention process are two completely different ball games, and this isn't something we've really had to look at before, as you mentioned. So.
Ariel, I did want to ask you one other sort of demographic question about the Republican vote. We talk a lot about what Bernie Sanders has done to the Democrats, energizing the youth vote. Is there a Republican youth vote? And if so, where are they going?
While there is a Republican youth vote, there isn't necessarily a candidate that represents that in the same way we see on the Democratic side with Bernie Sanders. A lot of young Republican voters are very split right now. We see people who tend towards Donald Trump, as we were talking about before. It has less to do with age and more where you live in the country and your socioeconomic status at this point.
Although we have seen Ted Cruz's campaign try to focus on younger Republican voters. They have been somewhat successful, not nearly as successful as Bernie Sanders. This is his very passionate base and one of the things that has really made him stand out as a candidate. But I look, for example, at the results in Missouri, which was a very close primary between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. And Ted Cruz ended up winning, if you looked at the map of this state, he ended up winning the areas of the state where there were universities. So the University of Missouri, some state universities, those were the places he did the best. And it was really the younger voters who carried him there.
Okay, we won't hold you to it, but if we had to wager right now, does this get settled before Cleveland?
I don't think that this will get settled before Cleveland at all. I think we can look forward to a very big fight on the convention floor and a lot of wheeling and dealing, and maybe a convention that lasts longer than expected. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be ironed out there.
Rebecca?
I'll agree with the disclaimer that it is going to be very, very close. And depending on how close it is, Donald Trump might be able, in the few weeks that there are between the end of voting and the convention, to try to bring some uncommitted delegates over to his side and get closer to that 1237 magic number. But I would still bet on an open convention being the outcome, which is very exciting.
Absolutely fascinating, just like replaying House of Cards' 4th season. Thank you very much for joining us, Ariel Cohen,
Thank
Rebecca
you.
Berg.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول قواعد اختيار المرشحين الرئاسيين، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.